And boom, we're live. Hello and welcome everybody to a
Hey.
new looking show. With us today, we've got two special guests who are both fiends in competitive Magic the Gathering as well as other games. To my right on screen, we got Ashley Thompson. Ashley, how you doing?
Hey, doing pretty good. Just came off winning a game of Warhammer, so that's a great way to prepare for a podcast.
And with sisters nonetheless, which is always great, right?
Oh, yes.
The best Imperium army, like no doubt at all, no
Hands
doubt at
down.
all. As well, we've got the Goose Man himself, the man you've seen on every single Discord on the 40k universe, who's never not offline. At Brendan McWerp, how you doing, buddy?
Doing good, doing good. I haven't been playing 40k over the last little bit, but I am building Seraphim 15 through 20 at the moment. So
I'm sure there's
no
not
thing that it turns any good.
Yeah, come on, what's 25 through 30, Brendan? Come on, what's going on, buddy? Come on, we've got to build those collections out.
They were
on
bad
the horizon.
Additions. I got to catch up.
I think by the fifth time you assemble Seraphim E, you're legally entitled to some kind of legal compensation from Games Workshop.
I think I've gotten the hang of it now. I think I'm on the 10th one, but I think I figured it out.
There you go.
Sure.
We're getting there. We're getting there. So today, as well as we'll talk about sisters along the way, because they're the best ladies on the Imperium and the best people and army in the Imperium, an army all three of us collect. My collection is definitely a lot smaller than all three of you, but leave that to the side. We also want to talk about, I guess, Magic the Gathering mostly, and then other competitive games, whether it's esports or tabletop games, and how those lessons learned from those other games can translate over to Warhammer in the 40k sense or AOS or whatever you want to do. So, but firstly, starting with yourself, Brendan McWerp. So, for people who don't know you or haven't seen you on a Discord for whatever reason, like, how long have you been playing 40k for, and then why may people have heard you, or where maybe have people heard of you? And yeah.
Well, I started playing 40k in early 3rd edition, which is a very long time ago. And then I played for 3rd and 4th. And then by the end of 4th edition, I was in my late teens. And I didn't like what 5th edition did to the game at all, for a variety of reasons. And also, I was at the point where I was no longer at home, no longer had a vehicle. And at that point in my life, with a metal army and a fishing tackle box full of metal miniatures, putting those things on transit wasn't really a thing you could do. So switching over to other games that were much lighter was kind of the idea at the time. And I ended up playing Magic pretty competitively for quite a few years. And then the beginning of the pandemic, I got back into the hobby, as I'm sure many people did. The launch of Sisters was something I'd been waiting, decades for. And it looked like 40k was starting to be a bit more of an actual competitive game. So it was a good time to kind of get back into it. Locally, they took a long time with the pandemic and regulations for us to actually get to play any real life games. But that gave me a lot of time to very, very slowly paint miniatures.
No, that's awesome. And so are you Sisters aficionado through and through? Like, you'll stray never from the Emperor's Light in that sense, or do you collect other armies?
In 3rd and 4th, I played Steel Legion Imperial Guard, but I was in my early teens, so the idea of a second entire metal army was not really something I could afford. But one of the local players had a gorgeous Sisters army that I always loved, and I loved that original Witch Hunters Codex way back in the day. I was kind of dreamed about having an army, and then when the plastic stuff released, I was like, oh no, this is dangerous. And I got rid of my old guard a long time ago. I gave them to a local guy who wanted some for his kids. And at that point, Warhammer was basically worthless because it was middle of 6th edition. And now looking back, those models are probably worth more than my current army. So I kind of wish I still had them, but hey, I'm sure that kid enjoyed them.
Oh, I'm sure that person is, and like maybe you'll see it one day, right? Like maybe it'll pop out of nowhere. It's like, hey, hang on a second, that's fine, and maybe you can acquire it back maybe one day. Maybe we'll see. So all good. So how long have you been playing 40k for, and like how did you get into it?
Well, I got into it via the Lord of the Rings gateway drug, as Games Workshop intended. So ended up getting Battle for Macragge set was my first 40k thing, and that was, I remember it was a couple of months before the 4th edition Tyranid Codex came out, because I loved the Tyranids, and I wanted to get the army, but I couldn't buy the Codex yet because there was another one about to arrive. So I was just checking, that was 2005, so kind of, early 05. And then kind of similar story. Played, I think, until my memory gets a bit fuzzy of which editions I actually played and which ones I just saw the rules of and said, "Ha, that's stupid." But I think I played until early 6th edition, and then dipped until also about the same time as McWerp, just kind of during the pandemic, as 9th edition was released, and we got the trailer with the sisters in the trailer. I thought, oh my goodness, I always wanted a sisters army, but I was a teenager and couldn't afford all the metal models. So now they get a whole new, the main characters with their own trailer. I should get back into the game and collect sisters, and it'll be awesome. And it was.
It still
Sisters
is
are great.
awesome, right? Sisters
Yeah,
are still great.
yeah. Sisters are amazing. I don't always like the rules, but I still love having them right on my shelf over there.
There you go. That's what matters most. As long as, it doesn't maybe matter most, but at least it matters a little bit, right? As how cool your models look and what they look like on the tabletop. So, Brendan, you gonna add something?
No, it's all good.
Oh, no, all good. No worries. Yeah. Yeah, similar story to me, Ash. Like I got in very similar Lord of the Rings magazine gateway drug. It was like in Australia, like you got sort of issues of like Lord of the Rings. You got little bits and bobs, like it was like $3 or $4 Australian dollars, whatever it was, and then Battle for McCrag, the one with the orcs and space marines. I was in and out. So there you go. Very similar storylines. Black Reach, that's the one. Black Reach. So.
I love Death Copters. I don't know why they kind of got rid of them. It's a great unit.
Oh, they're still there, but anyways, that's another story. During the whole Speed Freaks day, anyways, that's another tangent. We're not here to talk about orcs. We're here to talk about Magic the Gathering and other competitive games and how they relate to Warhammer. Well, that's another podcast, Ash. That's another podcast.
Sorry.
But so yeah, it's all right. Yeah, how dare you go on tangents, Ash? What is this? But no, handing over to you, Brendan. So I understand you have quite an extensive background in Magic the Gathering, but what other competitive games do you have like a background in, or what have you played? I know we talked pre-show a little bit about them.
So I basically, every game I've played, I ended up playing competitively to a certain extent. It's just kind of the way my brain works. I played StarCraft 2, I played Warcraft 3 Frozen Throne, I played War Machine, I played almost all the auto battlers, League of Legends, Magic the Gathering. I think that's most of it. But yeah, a lot of different games over a long time.
Yeah, that more than fair. And I think, Ash, like, why have you? When did you start playing Magic Gathering? Like, what other competitive games have you played in the past?
Yeah, Magic I got into a couple of years before Warhammer, so I would have been very small at the time. But yeah, Magic was one of the first things that I got into. Then also StarCraft 2, played that a bunch competitively. I played a bunch of Dota, which scarred me for life. Love the game. It's still really fun to play, but dealing with Dota players is... and aside from that, it's a bit different, but I have been pretty into Dungeons & Dragons character optimization stuff, which has a lot of similarities to competitive play, except without the competition.
So for someone who's never heard that term ever in my life, what the hell is that? For Dungeons & Dragons, what?
Character optimization. It's about making your character really strong and badass. And, oh, look, I can kill X number of level-appropriate monsters. Basically, it's a lot like building an army in 40k. Just with the same, here's my whole pile of options, let's put them together in a way that's cool and fun and also effective at the same time.
Sure, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. I know I've heard of like something. So I think it was a Nova or other events. They used like challenges for Dungeons and Dragons, and like teams of parties would go through the game. Essentially, it's a competitive environment, but try and beat the game and like abuse the rules to the best extent. So I knew there's always a way to competitive something, right? I mean, there's some dumb things like competitive conkers. I know Rob the Honest will go like a little thing about conkers, like little fruit thing, and then like competitive like ankle kicking. I know. Anyway, when there's a game, there's always a community. Some people who want to make it competitive, right? Even competitive Lord of the Rings, competitive Horus Heresy, all the jazz. But anyways, that's a whole nother tangent of things to go. So, Brendan, handing over to you. So, what sort of areas of Magic did you used to play? And maybe explain what those formats are for people who maybe have never played Magic or only know a little bit about Magic the Gathering.
So I kind of think I played Magic kind of in the competitive golden age. Before it got really weird over the last decade, but after most of the cheaters got chased out in the 90s. There was a period right when they first started giving out flights with the invites to the Pro Tour, and that was kind of when the game really exploded. You could play whatever they rotated through formats like throughout the year. Usually they were like 4 big tournaments a year, and they'd have a different format for each one. The ones I played the most were Modern, Standard, Limited, and then just whether various one got thrown in there, Extended or Legacy, or you just played whatever they were playing, basically. My favorite formats were definitely Modern and Limited for various reasons. But if the Standard was the one that we're playing, you just had to play what was the format. I played pretty much mostly locally. I never quite qualified for the Pro Tour. I came close a few times, but always managed to lose that winning in. But I played in lots of GPs up and down the Western Coast, and basically every single Pro Tour qualifier in BC I played in for probably about 10 years. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so BC being British Columbia, so McWerp, located in like Vancouver, Canada regions for people who international listening. So that's where he's referring to on the West Coast. So like Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, all those jazz. So all across the West Coast of the USA. And for people who aren't aware, so what is the Pro Tour? Maybe Ashley can take over. So what is a Pro Tour, and like what maybe some people in Warhammer could relate to?
I might not be as well equipped to answer that question. I didn't participate in the Pro Tour, but as I understand it was basically just you gain points by playing in events, and then once you get enough, you can qualify for the actual Pro Tour. You get points by playing the smaller events, and those qualify you for the Pro Tours, which are the big ones for all the fame and glory and prize money, which is definitely a format that I'm very jealous of. It's one that we kind of have over in the magical land of Tabletop Simulator, with people earning points for playing in basically any TTS events, and then every 6 months, Trevi does an invitational for people who are top 16 at the moment, and it's so much better than just here's one giant event, everyone dogpile in, whoever wins it is crowned king of 40k. So I think there's a lot that 40k could learn from that format, definitely. It's one of my personal rant buttons. You should not have thrown this question to me at all. Bad idea.
That's right.
I can go into a little more detail if you want.
Yeah, go ahead, Brendan. Go ahead.
So the Pro Tour has changed its format quite a few times, and it sounds like Ashley's talking about the one after when I was really heavily involved. They went to a points-based system, and that was kind of the beginning of me phasing out of my competitive play. Before that, there was sort of a cross system that was sort of, it wasn't points-based, but you could earn a certain level. Like there was gold level, silver level, platinum level. Different levels got you different things. And then also there were a bunch of individual events. And if you either won or did really well in those events, you can get an invite. And the Pro Tour top prize was usually around $40,000. And then second prize was like $20,000. It kind of cut down to 10 pretty quickly. And the events were usually about 400 players. But if you won an invite, you got your flight. I don't think you got hotel paid for, but you got flight paid for. And that was really cool because that was when the game went worldwide. Before it was pretty North America focused, European focused. But when you started paying for flights, you started to get people in from Brazil, people in from Chile, people in from Japan a lot. Because suddenly they could actually come to the big events. Because before, $1,000 flight's pretty hard to cough up. A Pro Tour is kind of, I think that's kind of what they're trying to do with Games Workshop and the Atlanta event. I think that's kind of what they're heading towards.
The golden tickets and stuff?
Yeah, the big GPs were more like kind of an LVO style event where it was just anybody could show up and play, and whoever did best, whereas the Pro Tours were invite only. So I kind of think that's what they're doing with Atlanta. I think Mike is kind of taking his ideas sort of from that back then, and I'm curious to see where that all goes.
Yeah, I think that's a very good analogy. So what Mike Brandt and the GW team are doing with the golden ticket events is very similar to the early days of like the Pro Tour in the sense of you get an invitation. So the golden ticket being like based upon how you rank in an event, based upon their criteria. And if someone hasn't got it before, you get an invitation to an event. And then from that event, you'll be crowned the Warhammer World Champion. But these Pro Tour events would happen like 3-4 times a year, or like is it all like you become almost like in golf how you have like, they call it the Pro Tour. You get invited to a select circuit of events that happen throughout the year. Maybe Brendan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the Pro Tour events would happen like 3 or 4 times a year, and like there would be like a Magic World Champs, which was one of these events. And I guess for people who are in like a CS:GO, like Counter-Strike or League of Legends, Dota, you would have like these 3 or 4 majors, which are events which are teams get invited to or qualify for, and like there was like 1 or 2 events which are of an equivalent status per se. Is that correct in my assumption, Brendan?
Pretty much. The amount of events changed from time to time. 5 was the most I think there ever was, and then they went down to 3, and it just depended on how much money they were investing into it at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a way in which competitive Magic the Gathering players could almost earn a living per se, is getting onto the Pro Tour and winning some of these events. And as well as that they sort of had different circuits. I know, like so Star City Games and Channel Fireball, which I'll hand over to, I guess, Ashley. Maybe you can. Do you understand like all the Star City Games, Channel Fireball, and like whole how these different like tournament organizers and they had the circuits to go into the Pro Tour? Does that
I never really paid attention to?
Sure.
Yeah, different events were run by different organizations. That's basically, I mean, I kind of assumed it was something like we've got with FLG, WTC, like different groups of people can all be running different officially sanctioned events, but I didn't check out the deets.
The Pro Tour was usually run just by Wizards of the Coast, but depending on the era, there were basically ITC and UKTC style groups that would run their own events that sometimes queued you for Pro Tours and sometimes didn't.
But yeah, it was like an interesting way in which they sort of had like different tournament organizers. So I know in the US, for example, like Channel Fireball, so it's like a major like tournament runner, but also like a local gaming store. So like what Frontline Gaming essentially do in the US right now, they sort of have like, I guess, a monopoly on the US in that sense of the ITC. But then there's Star City Games, which is based in the East Coast, in like Pennsylvania region. They also ran like these tournament series, which had like a bunch of events, and they'll qualify for the Pro Tour, was my understanding. So interesting way of doing things. And then they had their own like sort of side events. So I guess like they're sort of considered minor events in comparison to the Pro Tour, but maybe going down the tangents. So maybe just some good context for people. And I'll get you McWerp to expand. So like you talked about previously about what legacy is and what limited and modern. What the hell are those terms? And like what maybe would there be like an equal Warhammer correspondence would be? Because in 40k, in competitive 40k at least, we don't really get much differential. We get like 2k competitive essentially, and that's literally it.
That's a hard analogy to draw. I guess legacy would be kind of like if you could pick any rules from any point in any edition and play that. So if you wanted to take, Sisters from 3rd and then a Canonist from 8th, you could play them together. I guess it would kind of be like Legacy. It's basically the most powerful format that doesn't involve the cards that are thousands and thousands of dollars. You do very broken things.
It still involves some of those, right?
At this point, maybe. When I was playing it, no. But at this point, maybe.
Fair.
Yeah.
And then Modern was kind of like, I guess the best explanation would be like the last couple editions. Like you could take anything, like it could get pretty wild and pretty broken, but it wasn't as crazy as Legacy. And then Standard is just the most recent stuff. Last year and a half or so of cards. And the problem with, I think Modern at this point actually might be close to Legacy because I don't think it rotates. I don't know. It's been a while since I played.
No, it doesn't.
Standard is just like, it's a heavy rotation, which is one of the reasons I actually think Magic's kind of more expensive than 40k, kind of sneaky wise, because you just have to keep buying new stuff over and over and over and over again to keep in with it. And the longer I played competitive, one of the reasons I got out was because I started to be very heavy, kind of pushing Standard for the competitive format, and it just got so crazy expensive to keep up with it.
Yeah, so you talked about their rotating, so I'll hand it over to you, Ashley. So what is this rotating format idea? Maybe you could explain it, so like how competitive Magic works in that sense.
Yeah, so roughly every 3 months, they come out with a new set. There are some small sets that kind of go adjacent to that release schedule, but last I checked, it was once every 3 months you get a big headline new set that is a main set thing. And each format has some restriction for which sets you can play. Standard, they keep on changing the rules. roughly speaking, it's something along the lines of any sets released in the past 2 years, you can use all the cards in those sets to make your deck. And then the other formats are all just different stuff with their own kind of arbitrary cutoff points. Like Modern is everything after 8th edition, starting with Mirrodin, I think, something like that. And
Yeah,
then
something like that.
Vintage is everything that's not banned. So, yeah, that kind of, you can rock up to a Legacy event with one of the cards from Alpha, the first set ever printed back when they didn't know how to design cards. At least not for competitive. There's a lot of good things to be said about Alpha and its design. I won't try to impugn Richard Garfield's name, but they aren't really suited for competitive play, but you can just show up with them anyway, and that's kind of the gimmick of the format. And yeah, 40k doesn't have any analogy to that, which is probably for the best, because it would get real wacky real fast. Although, you could try to say something like, in theory, we could try to create a format where, like, I think that the 40k was best 6 months into 9th edition. Let's just get all the rules that were there and then call this an eternal format that never changes, and we can all go back and play that whenever we want. Or we can play standard with the newest, wackiest rules that Games Workshop have released. That might be interesting. I don't think we've got nearly enough community consensus on what a good period in 40k's history would be to snapshot one spot and then build a competitive scene around playing that particular era forever. It doesn't sound like it'd ever happen, but it could be neat.
Yeah, it's obviously a different way in which they do competitive games and like a business model. Like some Magic obviously releases cards, and like some are removed out of like I guess the competitive playing format. But whereas some stay. I guess like Legends units and stuff like that is sort of a bit of an analogy. Like there's sort of older cards you could bring in. But anyway, so it's just maybe some context for people who've never played Magic and how it sort of works. So like Legends models are allowed to be used, and unlike I guess 40k, in which you can adjust in Magic as well, they sometimes errata what the card says, or they can change what the card does. Generally, they'll ban them or limits to like a one of per se. So in a deck, you can maybe have, depending on the game and stuff, like you can have 4 of X, or they adjust the points. But anyways, that's a big tangent. So just good to know and good understanding. So Brendan, you mentioned there before about like Magic becoming more expensive than 40k. So do you maybe want to elaborate on that? So do you think that's true or not? Because we always hear that Warhammer is an expensive hobby, and in the competitive sense, it is quite expensive. Obviously, traveling to events and collecting an army and paying it all and stuff like that. But you said Magic may be more expensive. Do you want to explain maybe why that may be? Or, in your opinion, why?
Well, the rotation of Standard is just incredibly aggressive and expensive. And over the last 5 or so years, Magic's release schedule has ramped up to an absolutely absurd degree. There's some graphs out there showing the number of cards released each year, and it's a very slow increase until about 5 years ago when the graph suddenly like triples. And it's like they used to release like 500 cards a year, and now they're up in like the 1,600 range. Like it's just there's so much new stuff, and every set needs to have chase rares that you have to buy, and it becomes so expensive so quick. If you're
it's that and power creep as well, because you would need to always buy the strongest new cards, even for older formats. They're still filled with new cards these days.
Like Legacy, even though you can play any card ever, it's pretty exclusively dominated by new cards. Like there's specific old cards that are in every deck, but the decks that they play now in Legacy are completely different from decks that they would have played 10 years ago, even though the format doesn't rotate because there's so many new cards being pushed in all the time. And I think over the course of my Magic career, I probably spent about 10 grand at least on Magic, like at least. Now I was playing for a decade and a half, and that includes going to events and stuff, but like I could buy like 4 full 40k armies for that. And yeah, now 40k doesn't hold its value quite as well as Magic does, but you know.
Yeah, depending on the card, right? Like, so do you maybe expand it a bit more? Maybe do you understand like, the resale and like the financials behind Magic?
I try not to understand that stuff. It is eldritch knowledge, but I do end up picking up a bunch of it anyway. I mean, it's just people will buy old cards because they're powerful for old formats, or because they just have collector's value. You know, Black Lotus, the most iconic one, can go for. Wasn't there like a signed one that went for over $100,000? No, it was like over $500,000. Something real stupid. yeah, people will just pay spectacular amounts of money for Magic cards because they think that they're cool, and yeah, they are. There are some really neat ones that I'd probably pay some money for. But there's also the secondary market of just for purely competitive reasons, people will say, oh, look, new set has come out. Let's go and buy 20 boxes full of boosters for this set, open them up, just toss out everything but the card at the back, which is the rare, and then if that one's worth money, put it on the pile of things to sell to other people later. So if you're trying to get those expensive rares that only show up in, I don't know the numbers, one in a very small number of packs, and you need 4 copies of that new card for your standard deck, that will set you back a lot of money.
And if that card is Wraith Knight equivalent.
Yeah. And then suddenly every single copy of that card in the world gets opened and sold for stupid amounts of money. But I think for me, Magic was actually a lot cheaper than 40k. And mostly that is because I exclusively played Limited, at least in competitive ways. And Limited is something that, God, I wish you could make this work for 40k because it fixes so many problems with Magic and it's just the best way to play it. To kind of sum up for those who haven't played it, the most common form of Limited is Draft, where you just have a group of people, each open 3 booster packs with 15 cards in them, and you take one from your pack, pass it on, take one from the pack that's got passed to you, pass it on. So by the end of it, everyone has 45 cards that they've just pulled out of packs and put together, and then you use those to make decks, and you play, and then after your 3 to 5 maybe matches, you just take those cards home and go play another time. So it's a lot cheaper because you don't have to go out and buy all the expensive cards. You just kind of hope that the really good cards show up in the packs that you were given. And if they do, then you get one event where you get to stomp all over everyone with your amazingly overpowered Wraith Knight thing. But they tend to be, the super overpowered cards Limited tend to be pretty rare, so you don't see them that often. And for the most part, the game is just played with the kind of mediocre cards that aren't overpowered, and so you get a lot of normal, reasonable games without egregious bullshit, which is just a lovely way to experience the game. And I have tried to make something like this work for 40k in some way, and it just you just can't do it, unfortunately.
Another good thing about Limited is a lot of times the cards that are good in Limited are different than the cards that are good in Constructed. So you get to play with a lot of cards you don't normally play with. Like a card that might be good in Limited might be completely unplayable in Constructed, but it wins you like 3 or 4 matches in a row. And yeah, it's just it's a very, like, Limited's the best. Limited is the best.
It really is. And I mean, I didn't grind out mass games for Pro Tours or whatever of Limited, although they kind of stopped doing Limited at Pro Tour. Anyway, let's not complain about that. But just going to one FNM a week and playing Limited with a bunch of people cost me, I think it was $21 entry fee, which is Australian dollars. That's not as much money as international people probably think. And you got to keep most of the cards that you drew, that you pulled out of your packs, and you got prize support as well. So going to FNM for years at a time costs relatively small amounts of money, and you end up with a giant pile of cards you can just resell. If you win a bunch of money, you can go positive and earn. So if you win a bunch of games, you can sell all the good cards you earned and then earn money from doing it. So in terms of finances, I find that comparing my experience with the Magic, $20 a week to play just to play Limited at the highest possible level, you can't pay more money to win at Limited, versus 10th edition coming out and me looking at, I have a lot of Drukhari already, but in order to put together the 2,000 list that I'm currently playing on TTS, I would need to throw about $1,000 at Games Workshop, and then also find a way to get 7 more Dark Lances 3D printed for Scourges. So 40k can definitely cost a lot of money. I'm sure we are all familiar with that.
If you're good at Limited, you can definitely defray a lot of the costs. When Arena came out, I basically went infinite unlimited for like a year, just because I could use the packs to enter back in, and you could earn the rewards to redraft again and again and again. And when Arena first came out, everybody on there was terrible, so
yes.
You could basically just draft
I won
stuff
so many games. It was great.
Yeah, so a context there. So Ashley mentioned FNM, so that Friday Night Magic. So basically, it's like an RCT equivalent. So very traditional in Magic settings. That every Friday night at the local gaming store, you play a game essentially. So it'd be like a weekly RTT equivalent, like at the set time, a local gaming store. And then Brendan's saying Arena, which is Magic Gathering Arena, which is Magic's online platform. So as well as the actual card game itself, they have an online platform now, which is their main one. Previously, it was like MTGO, so Magic the Gathering Online, which still exists, but Magic the Gathering Arena is their more popular and the sort of updated format per se. So just good to know. And yeah, a different format and something we don't really see in 40k. I guess Path to Glory, I know it's like not a competitive format, but where you like roll a dice, you randomly get a unit or something like that, maybe an equivalent sort of thing, but it's very different in a sense.
Heard of that. But
yes, in Path to Glory for Warhammer, like in Crusade and stuff like that, you roll a dice and you get like random upgrades or random units, or like go up that way. So maybe like an equivalent per se for people who are curious. So we talked a lot about, I guess, all the financials and history of Magic, but let's sort of translate this over to a competitive environment and like lessons learned. So starting with yourself, Ash, what were some of the biggest fundamentals you learned from maybe Magic and your other competitive games, such as like Dota, that you think have translated over to you in Warhammer? Because you're quite a good player at Warhammer, and I know you've talked about how your history in Magic has helped you become a better player at Warhammer.
Yeah, so a lot of it is very broad and hard to put into specific words. It's just learning how to be good at a game, where there are certain patterns where even if the rules are different, there are just ways to look at things and evaluate and understand what you need to do. So I think one of the things that I focused on is to look at, consider what am I trying to say? Consider whether your thought processes were correct, rather than look at whether you ended up winning due to some lucky outcome, which I learned mostly from Magic, where you get the classic example of someone makes a play and it doesn't work out for them, and then they look at their top card of the deck that they would have drawn next time if only they'd lived, and they said, "Oh no, I should have done this instead." But I'm going on a bit of a another one of my rant buttons there. I shouldn't focus too much on that.
No, please. So I think it's good to important note there. So Warhammer is a game of perfect information. In the sense you know everything that could possibly happen. So you can always ask your opponents, "What's this unit's data sheet? What can they do, etc." And you know all their stratagems, relics, enhancements. But in Magic the Gathering, it's different. It's hidden information in the sense of you do not know what's in a person's card or what's in their deck. Like poker hand, you don't know what another person has, but pattern recognition and understanding how things work and understanding the game is part of it. So that's maybe where Ash is referring to, like top decking a card.
Which like one thing you see a lot of the time is someone will say, "Oh, I need to pass this 3 up. Oh, look, I rolled a 1." And then they say, "Okay, it's not that important. I won't CP reroll." And then they'll say, "But just to check what would have happened, pick up the die, roll it again." And then they say, "Oh, look, it would have been a 3. I should have used my CP." But that's nonsense. You don't roll it and then say, "Oh, if it turned out to be a 3 in the hypothetical universe where I rolled it, therefore it was a bad decision to not reroll." You should just look at the situation as it stands and evaluate, is it a good idea to spend a CP for a 2 in 3 chance of succeeding at this thing? And that's something that I definitely got from Magic. Just the idea of look at your decisions and the game state. Don't necessarily focus on unknown RNG factors from outside your control.
Ash, when I mulligan, I always look.
I know, you've told me this in the past, and it's one of the things that made me hate you.
So what's a mulligan, so Brendan? So like I guess mulligan. You could explain for people who've never heard of the term mulligan.
Start of the game of Magic, you draw a hand of a certain amount of cards, depending on what game you're playing. Usually 7, and then depending on which era you were playing in, there's certain rules where you can redraw. Kind of like how elves get to reroll all their fate dice if they get no 6s. But usually it's a decision based on I either have too many lands, because lands are kind of like your resource to do things, or I have too few lands. Usually you're sitting there doing a little bit of math in your head. Okay, I have 2 draws before I run out of lands. I have this many lands in my deck. I'm probably going to hit. What happens if I hit? What happens if I don't hit? And you just got to do the math in your head. And the math doesn't change no matter what the top card of your deck is. So some people say you should never look. You made the right decision. You did the math. It was good to do it or it wasn't good to do it. Or some people say, but I want to know. And I always wanted to know.
Which is fine if it's just curiosity, but I think to some extent people do trick themselves into thinking, oh look, I rerolled it and it was a 3. I should have rerolled it, and in future situations I'm going to remember this and say, okay, I'm going to reroll it because that one time I did a test reroll that didn't even happen and it was a 3. So
I kind of like to approach it more as like with mulliganing, especially, is when I actually look at it, it makes me think, oh, how would this have gone? It makes it more real. So if I think, oh yeah, but if I hit that land, I don't know if it's as good. But then if I actually look and I go and I'm like, oh, and the card after was this thing, like it doesn't actually affect your decisions, at least in the moment. But especially with how many games you can play in Magic, like you can just grind games in a way that you just can't in 40K. If you think you should mulligan a hand and then you play 70 games, and it turns out when you were mulliganing, you would have made it 30% of the time, maybe that affects your decision in certain matchups. Magic's got a lot more kind of minute math that comes up a lot.
Yeah, when I translate to 40K, it's a lot harder to make that argument because you know that 1 in 3 times you would have made the reroll. It's just you're rerolling a d6. We all know how that works. There's no need to test it, guys. You're just tricking yourself into making bad decisions. And that's a very small thing that I probably shouldn't have fixated on, but it just bothers me. I think one actually important thing that I learned from playing Magic to steer things back into a more sensible place is the idea is just sacrificing resources and what's okay to lose and what isn't. There's a very good common statement by Magic players, which is that 1 is not 0. You start a game of Magic on 20 life. You lose if your life drops to 0. Under most circumstances, there's weird cards, whatever. And if you are on 1 life, then nothing happens at all. There's no penalty. You don't bracket a player. So a lot of new players, when they come into Magic, will be absolutely terrified of taking damage, and they will throw so many resources in the way to stop their opponent from doing a single point of damage to them. And none of that means anything, and they lose the game because they sacrificed a bunch of stuff to stop themselves from dropping from 20 life to 10. So 1 is not 0 is basically saying that the only point of life that matters is the last one. You can sacrifice anything you want. You can take as much damage as you want as long as you aren't sacrificing resources on the board. And then with those resources that you didn't throw away, you can probably win the game. And on the other hand, there's a lot of situations where you have to sacrifice stuff that you have in play in order to make something happen. And just that process of looking at identifying a win condition, really, and identifying a loss condition, and being able to say, because Magic is a much simpler game than 40K in terms of, there's 60 cards in each deck. They come in on discrete formats. You can't say, this card is 0.2 inches further away from the side than it would have been, therefore I win. It's a much more concrete experience. So it's much easier to identify in Magic, this is the thing that needs to happen. These are the cards I need to draw. These are the creatures I need to kill in order for me to win this game. Nothing else matters. So let's focus on how I'm going to win and what my path to making that happen is. And that was a really important skill for 40K, just learning what I can sacrifice, what matters, what doesn't matter, how can I win this game, and just being able to focus on finding that line from point A to point B that ends in you succeeding.
No, I think that's a great point, man. I think maybe an equivalent would be maybe in like a singles environment where differential doesn't matter. Like if my opponent scores 96, but I scored 97, I still win the game. So maybe allowing yourself to be 1 ahead or 2 ahead, maybe an equivalent stakes. Like they can score as many points as they want as long as I still win in the end. But where if they score another point and I'm less, potentially I lose. Do you think that maybe that's a good equivalency? Or I know it doesn't translate directly, but
I think a bit of a better equivalency might be if you're falling behind early, it's okay if you can win late, rather than panicking about losing life. Because one thing I was agreeing with Ashley. I think one thing I learned from Magic is there's this concept in 40K of trading, where I trade a unit with your unit, and people are like, "Oh, I traded up. My 150 point unit killed your 350 point unit." And I found I've won a lot of games of 40K because people think they're trading up or they're making good trades. And it's because they're thinking about how many points they paid to put the unit in their army. That's irrelevant. Once you're on the table, how many points you paid for a unit doesn't matter. It's what that unit can do for you on the table. If I put a unit in a corner and you send a 500 point unit over there to kill it and you destroy it and you own that corner, well, great. Are there objectives in that corner? Does that corner do anything else for you? Like, people get focused on trading, and I think like things that I learned from Magic, like tempo, at card advantage, kind of apply to 40k in a way that people don't really think they do, because they're so focused on the way they look at the game. They don't think my Wraith Knight's so important. Yeah, well, if it's off killing a bunch of 20-point dorks in that corner, it doesn't matter how good it is, really, right?
Yeah, and I think one thing I notice a lot of people get very precious with their good unit, and they will say that, this is my 300. I saw this a bunch of times towards kind of late ninth when people were using the Iron Hands Contemptor Dreadnought of Doom. I spent 270 whatever points on this and 3 command points, and it must survive at all costs, no matter what, because if it dies, then bad things. It's my good unit. I need to keep it alive, and what they often didn't look at was, okay, what is this good unit actually doing to the game? And I beat several people who were playing Iron Hands by just saying, okay, cool, you've got a Dreadnought. Great work, buddy. I'm going to score my points. I'm going to do no damage to it. They spend heaps of time and effort trying to carefully position it, hide it behind walls so I couldn't possibly get a tiny little angle to shoot it with one Dire Avenger. And by the end of the game, they have kept the Dreadnought alive, and they have kept themselves down to 30 victory points, and I crushed them. Because they weren't looking at their path to victory, what they needed to do to win, and what I needed to do to win. They were just looking at, this is my cool unit, and it's important if I keep it alive because it's a good unit.
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic. A really good analogy. So, like, understanding it, each game, depending on the scenarios, your win path or the way you win the game is different. So, for example, traditionally, maybe your Wraith Knight was the one that fucking killed everything along the way. But in this one game, your Wraith Knight is useless or should be used in a different way to what it normally is. I think that's a really good statement and analogy. Brendan, anything else that maybe you learned from Magic that could be relevant for 40k and Warhammer in general, or any other competitive games?
Just doing constant math all the time. Like when you're playing Magic at a high level, you are constantly doing math about what you're going to draw. And I know earlier you said it's a game of hidden information. It is, but you have a pretty good idea of what cards are in your opponent's deck. You play enough games, you have a pretty good idea of how they're playing. You can look at the things they've done throughout the game and think, if they did that, it probably means they have this. Like, there's a lot of ways. It's kind of like poker, where it's hidden information, but if you're good at it, you can figure out what's going on. And it's all based on just tons of little math calculations as you go. And when you start doing those sort of little math calculations over and over again, you don't necessarily get good at getting them exactly correct, but you get a pretty good idea of what's likely to happen. And I think that kind of skill really translates to 40k really well, because a lot of people say, on average, I killed that unit. And it's like, well, average only happens half the time, and often not even that. So half the time you lost because you made that play. Like, that's not a good idea.
Yeah, so what would be some examples for you, Brendan, that you use in 40k? Are some math examples. So obviously, it's very easy to do like those unit and damage calculators, but maybe taking a differential amount in a sense of anticipating. But are there anything else that you take into account now with 10th edition?
Oh, God, 10th edition.
Don't say those words.
Basically, 10th edition, I don't even do the math because my units don't kill anything, so it's fine. I just send things in and hope for the best, and then try and play the mission as much as I can. That's how I've been playing 10th edition with Sisters. It's an ugly mess, that's for sure.
That's fair enough. Fair enough. I think it's important though with math, like you mentioned there in the deck of cards. Obviously, so when you take tactical objectives, there's 1 in 16 chance of one card being drawn. Noting that obviously, like during the first battle round, some can't be drawn, shuffled in, and stuff like that. But when you get to those later rounds, it's maybe worthwhile checking off a list and saying, "Hey, I have a chance of doing this, 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 or this." Like investigate signals. In a classic example, you have to do actions in the corners or engage on all fronts. I have to do this. Maybe try and anticipate or know what your chances are of these things happening. You can probably the turn earlier predict what's going to happen and what's going from there. So I know that's maybe an example of something you can use, and I think that's something I've been trying to do now in 10th edition. Is okay, late game, I know what my tactical objectives are. What can I anticipate is going to happen? So I don't know. That's
actually a really good. That's a really good point. With Sisters, at least, we have so much shit, just chaff running around the board. You don't actually have to think that much about what you can do. What I found is when my opponent's doing tactical, if I'm thinking about what they can do and how I can make that more difficult or hard, that's been leading to me doing well when I shouldn't. Like, if I don't give them an easy bring it down, or I give them a very cheap bring it down, then they can't score that 8 points and catch up kind of thing. Especially as you get later in the game and you get more information. Early in the game, it's hard because there's so many different things they could get. But later in the game, it's definitely a lot of memorization that I don't think many people are doing yet, for sure.
Yeah, not yet. I mean, like, we're still very early on. Like, people are still in like the dozens of games played per se, not in the hundreds just yet. But I think over time, like, people will have score sheets and say, hey, you could do this, this, and this, or they anticipate and like track knowledge. Because actually, one thing that's notable in Magic as well, maybe not as much as people individually, and like chess as well, they track moves. So in chess, they track this person did this, this, and this, and they track life total. So they did this, 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 and this. So maybe that's something that happens and corresponds over to 10th edition. It'll be interesting to see if it happens. But yeah, just a good side note. You mentioned before, McWerp, as well, about tempo. So terminology that's used in Magic as well as other games. I'm going to hand it over to you, Ashley, but can you maybe explain some of the terminology that's used in Magic that might be relevant for 40k? Like things that I can know of is like aggro, control, mid-range, and like stuff like that. And like some of those terminologies does translate over to 40k quite well, and maybe people could use them. And like, because when you hear tempo, it's like, what the hell's tempo mean? But I think people from a Magic background understand what that means.
Yeah, tempo is definitely more of a concept. It's difficult to put it into words exactly, but Magic has a really good way of understanding aggression, tempo, control, and stuff. Because for those who haven't played before, in Magic, every card, most cards. Magic has a lot of exceptions. You're gonna have to say most things for a lot of times, but pretty much every card that does something to the game has a cost, and you start off with a certain amount of mana, which you can then spend to play your cards out. It's like in 40k, if you, like in the first round, every unit that costs up to 50 points can be put onto the table, everything else stays in reserves. Then the second round, everything that costs up to 100 points you can put on the table, then 150. So your bigger, more expensive stuff may be more powerful, but it doesn't start the game out, and so you have to wait for it to come up. So an aggro deck would have just a lot of cheap creatures and spells so they can get all their stuff out really quickly. They just come in swinging. Their units, their cards aren't individually good, and they're a lot less efficient than a big stuff, but they're just hitting you right from turn one and trying to get you down to 0 life before you can build up your big stuff and stabilize the board. Whereas a control deck is kind of the opposite. It's all the big expensive stuff, and its job is to defend, stay alive, and then come in with its big haymaker spells that all have a drastic impact on the game, but they cost a lot of points. So in that, and mid-range is basically somewhere in the middle. You have a mix of stuff that does, you're not too expensive, not too cheap. You can do everything pretty decently. So tempo, how would you put it? It's about who is currently, there's a particular article called Who's the Beatdown, which is recommended to a lot of Magic players. And that's kind of how you would analyze tempo. It's looking at the game, who is currently at a disadvantage and who is currently stronger. The person who is stronger is the one who's going to be making all the aggressive plays. They're going to be attacking. They're going to be trying to probably trade resources one for one to try to keep their opponent on the back foot, stop them from stabilizing, getting out a few big expensive things, and then turning the game around. While the person who is on the defensive needs to recognize that and not frivolously throw away their stuff. And this doesn't translate perfectly in 40k, but it does translate pretty well in a lot of cases. Usually going to be more about scoring opportunities, I think, than about the units that you have. So, person who's winning a flank change, yeah, it's a pretty good way of putting it. If you just carry on with the same situation, then whoever is currently like Necrons from 9th edition during their brief period of glory, where they would just score 100 points for free, they always had the tempo advantage because at the start of the game, they are winning by a lot just from scoring infinite free points. And their opponent needed to try to do something drastic, make some big plays, kill heaps and heaps of Necrons as quickly as possible to try to turn that around and end up in a situation where they can kind of claw back the advantage. But then once that does happen, tempo changes over time, and that's the important thing. It's not just locked in at the matchup beginning. So if you played against that 9th edition, was it Nachman's Necrons? Nephilim? One of the ones, started with N.
Nachman, yep.
That's the one. Yeah, it started the game, you say, okay, they can score 97 points for free. I need to do something about this. You make a big aggressive play, you kill 2/3 of their army, and then suddenly you have a big scoring advantage. Now you're the one in charge, and you have to try to hold on to that advantage while the Necron player is on the back foot. They have worse tempo. They have to try to say, okay, I'm in a bad situation. How am I going to use my remaining units to try to do some clever, tricksy thing, deny your objectives here and here and here, and then claw back some points?
No, I think that's a really good explanation. McWerp, anything else you wanted to add on there, or maybe like explain some of those terms and how they maybe relate to 40k or Warhammer?
Yeah, like I used to play a lot of Burn in Modern, and everybody kind of sneers at Burn and says it's kind of silly and just aggro. And it is when you play it as a baseline. But there are so many times when suddenly you have to slow down. You've got them down to 3, but they untap with 4 cards in hand. Now you got to just wait. You got to wait till they do something, and then you try and kill them. Or in the Burn Mirror, whoever's on the draw is suddenly a control deck. You're no longer an aggro deck. The other guy's the aggro. You got to try to turn your aggro-focused Burn deck into a control deck all of a sudden. And I find that happens in 40k a lot. You'll have an army that's designed to be kind of slow and grindy, and then suddenly you'll be paired up against the one army in the game that's slower and grindier than you, and suddenly you have to go full aggro. And it's something that happens mid-game. You do something, or they do something, and suddenly you go from being in a controlled winning position to not being that. And you have to be able to instantly change the way you're approaching. So I think knowing your win conditions and like knowing your point scores is very important to competitive 40k, because it is a dice game, but most of the big important moves are made with the tape measure, not with rolling the dice.
Yeah, that's very, very fair. And I think the term like red deck wins, for people who are unaware, is like, so burn deck, so deal direct damage, like a red colored sort of field of magic per se, like traditionally quite aggressive and aggro, like in your face, alpha strikes are going to try and win early on, or like mid game per se. So maybe just some extra clarity and context there. So and thank you, Ashley, for mentioning Who's the Beatdown. So it's like a pretty notorious Magic the Gathering article. And we actually have a question from Greg saying, so we often hear about Who's the Beatdown as like a good one to understand tempo in 40k, but handing over to you, Brendan McWerp. Is there any other main concepts from Magic that maybe people in a Warhammer setting should learn about or read about that you know of? Or
Who's the Beatdown 2 is also really good.
Yes. Version 2.
Efficiency is kind of all through Magic. You're always caring about doing the most you can with the least you can. I think card advantage is something that actually... Hold on, sorry. Card advantage is something that actually... Yeah, it's fine, sorry. Card advantage is something that actually kind of translates over really well. In Magic, if you can answer your opponent's thing with your own thing and not lose a thing, that's a really big deal. So one thing I did a lot with Sisters at the end of 9th edition is I'd kill their unit on a point with my Sacrosanct on a point. And then I'd put the Sacrosancts in a point where they could heroic the entire objective. And my opponent would be stuck with a bunch of really hard, difficult decisions to make to try and kill that unit or take that point without losing something back. And if they fail, I took the point, I killed their thing, and I still have my thing. Being able to do that can be very crushing. You basically get just free value every time you achieve it. Now in 40k, I think it's a lot harder to do than in Magic. In Magic, basically almost every play you do is trying to do that. Whereas in 40k, like creating that situation is very hard. But if you can get rid of your opponent's resources without losing any of your own, that's a big deal.
Indirect fire. I mean, that's a 2-for-1 card advantage right there. Well, 0-for-1 really. But yeah, and there's a lot of times where you can do multiple things with a unit at once, and that's kind of like card advantage. So, don't just throw a unit onto an objective and say, cool, I got my secondary points or whatever. You can also spread them out to move blocks and stuff, or you can charge in, tie something in combat, and get on the objective at the same time. So just getting more value out of the unit that you're throwing away to die anyway that's definitely a big thing that I got from Magic.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic and great information and advice. So, we've talked a lot about Magic, and like it sounds like it's an amazing competitive scene. But but Brendan, why do you no longer play Magic, or why do you, I guess, maybe pursue Warhammer competitively? Because we always hear the rage online that how unbalanced Warhammer 40k is as a competitive game. Why do you pursue it, and why do you want to play it?
I think the big thing for me, basically what I got out of 40K, it was when the game, I think it was going down the drain. And while the sales figures and stock price would reflect that, I'm not sure everybody agrees with me, but it felt like they didn't give a shit about the game. They were focusing on models. They're focusing on this. They released rules like at random times over the course of years. You stuck with the same rules for ages. Like it wasn't a very well designed game, and the company publicly was basically saying, we don't care. At that point, Wizards of the Coast was very active in their development and very careful and meticulous in how they created the game. And they were also very supportive of the competitive scene, which is why I kind of say I went into the golden age. As I said, just when I was getting into the scene was when they started actually flying people across the world to play Magic. It was never a professional league. Like, you couldn't be a professional player just playing Magic. It was too hard to win, to reliably win. But you could get enough of a name to kind of do what Art of War are doing now, where they kind of have a career by being by being a 40K personality. It was never a very good career, but then what happened was over time, they got bought by Hasbro ages ago. Over time, capitalism did its thing, and it became all about how do we sell more cards today, not about how do we keep this game going for 30 years. And basically, the Pro Tour went from what I consider the golden age to what Ashley was describing, where it became points-based, where it was all about points and earning points, which became, you couldn't ever win an invite. You had to play 5 GPs and your local qualifier, and then also the next local qualifier. Then you do that other thing, and then you had to high-five that guy over there, and then you'd get an invite. And it was just very kind of grindy, and that wasn't a whole lot of fun for me. And then they basically killed it all together for something called the Magic Pro League, which actually was enough money for somebody to make it their professional career, but it was almost impossible to get in. They killed the whole drive and the dream of making it big. You either were big, or you were almost big, or you were nothing. Then they killed that altogether because that was a complete disaster, and basically gave up on competitive Magic for a few years, as far as I'm aware. I think the beginning of the pandemic and before, like, it was basically not even a thing. They've started to come back to it now, but Wizards of the Coast feels like it's approaching Magic now the way Games Workshop approached 40K when I got out of it. Whereas Games Workshop now feels like it's approaching 40K the way Wizards was approaching Magic when I got into it. Does that make sense?
No, I think that's completely fair. And so you think you see, I guess, the golden light, and not an Imperium sort of logic there, but you see the golden light of Mike Branch and the 40K competitive setting, something that they're working towards and improving. And even though it may not be balanced right now, there is, I guess, action or, I guess, results showing that they are looking to balance and improve the competitive setting of games.
They're trying, and they're coming at it from the right place. They're not necessarily doing it well yet, but they're getting better.
They were doing it pretty well in 9th edition, and then they kind of, all of this happened.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see like what happens from here on out. Like, I think these next couple of months is going to be the truest indication of, is Games Workshop going to make this a competitive game? Are there going to be updates made? Are there going to be changes made? Or are they just going to go, well, it is what it is? So it'll be interesting to see from that aspect. So heading over to you, Ashley. So we just talked a lot of crap about Games Workshop and Warhammer, why it's a bad competitive game and will never be balanced. But why do you want to pursue it as a competitive game? Do you just see a good outlet, or why?
So there are a bunch of things. Honestly, one of the biggest, most important reasons that I play 40K competitively is that it doesn't have much of a scene, especially compared to Magic, StarCraft, Dota, whatever, and people aren't very good at it. And what that means is that I was able to get into the game as 9th edition came out, and then my first ever tournament, again, I went 4-1 because I just had played other games before and I knew how to get good at a game, and I understood these basic things like trading and identifying your win condition. And then I qualified for the T5S2 Invitational on the very first 6 months that I started playing 40k. So just being able to be good at the game to an extent that you can be like recognized and people say, oh wow, you're that person I've seen on stream winning games. That's amazing. I can't believe I get to play against you. Because, with barely any effort, to be honest, it's a huge difference compared to something like StarCraft, where if you want to break into it, you have to be spending 18 hours a day grinding in a Korean pro house somewhere. Wait, do those not exist anymore? Whatever. But just how entrenched everything is and how ridiculously advanced all the high-level stuff is. And it's just really difficult to actually play those games competitively and feel like you matter and like you could accomplish something. So that there is quite a bit of it that's just ego, because I know that it's going to be easier to succeed in 40k, and I have that drive to be good at things and get accolades. But I would still never compete anywhere near as much if I didn't just love 40k and I wasn't kind of obsessed with it. What does make it so good as a competitive game? It's not, but I keep on coming back to it anyway, and I can't shake it. It's just, it's fun to play, and I can just sit in a great community, people I love talking to. Every time I get into a game, 95% of the time when I get into the game, I'll have a great experience, whoever I'm playing against, however the game ends up going. And that's something that you sure as hell don't get playing something like Dota, because every single game you play, that will be a miserable experience because of the community. And it changes enough to be exciting and new. You're always thinking about, what am I going to do with this new update? How does that change my list? What am I going to do about this new meta army? But enough things stay the same that you can still be good at the game. Plus, there's all the hobby stuff. I do love the models. I may play on TTS, but I have a bunch of painted models that I want to be able to play games with them one day, and I just look up at them and I think, oh man, that Ravager there looks great. I should go play a game with Drukhari. So, yeah, it's a package deal.
And for everyone else, you can still also play in real life events as well as TTS, right? but it actually is fun. They're subpar and they're a weird concept. But Ashley has attended in real life events. I can confirm this, so that's all right. Anyway,
drag me kicking and screaming, but I did.
We did it indeed. So, what are some things you think? So, handing over to yourself, Brendan. What are some things that you think Warhammer players and TOs still have to learn from other game systems like Magic the Gathering or StarCraft or Dota? What are some things you think that we still have to learn and that hasn't come across just yet?
Well, I kind of already made my big spiels about that over the last couple years, and now it's kind of in the game, which is weird. Have too big a mouth.
Percentages?
You have too big of a mouth. People might actually make changes based on the things you say. Be careful of that. But really, like 40K, when I came back to it, it was in the same state as when I left in like the late 90s. Like people were running their tournaments the exact same way they did back then, and it didn't make sense for the modern game and the way people were approaching it. There's lots of different methods and ways to run a tournament, and they all have benefits and issues. But every single event was run the exact same way, and they'd have the exact same issues, and then they go, well, we've tried nothing. What do we do? I guess we get mad at people for doing things that our system encourages them to do online with pitchforks, and then say, don't do that. We won't actually change the system to make doing that bad in any way whatsoever. However, I think the community has progressed very quickly, at least over the time I've been involved with it. There's been lots of changes and leaps forward as far as systems go. And everybody has their favorite ones, and everybody dislikes certain things. But I think it's getting a lot better. I think things are being run very, very well by most events now, at least on the event structure side.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we're making slow improvements, and like as things open up. So it'll be interesting to see where the golden ticket experience goes, and then where those balance updates and patches come. So obviously we had the balance data slates start in 9th edition. We'll see where they come this year. I think there's been rumors that it's only points every 3 months and actual data slate changes and stuff every 6 months. But it'll be interesting to see where that goes, and I think that'll be very telling. Ash, anything you want to add on there?
Yeah, I think the golden ticket concept is the main one that I would look at, because, oh my god, the idea that LVO was, at least was for quite some time, the 40k World Championship match, because it just had the most players going to it, it's just insane. And it encourages some really bad tournament organizing, because if all of your prestige and value of an event comes from being the one that is de facto the grand championships because it has the most people in it, then the TRs are going to want to just shove more and more people into this event, regardless of what that does to the quality of games. And you saw, the horrendous terrain at the last one, because they can't just not have 1,000 people show up and play in a single event over the course of what was like 3 days. It's insane. It doesn't work. I mean, 40k cannot function on that scale. So having something that encourages events that are smaller, more manageable, and ideally more frequent, that eventually culminates in an actual, official Games Workshop sponsored, paid for, hopefully, event would be a huge improvement over just this one has the most people. There you go. Star event of the year. That's the one that matters. Everything else doesn't matter.
Yeah,
and
I think that's
ITC
pretty...
points were a thing as well, but yeah, LVO definitely had the prestige associated with it.
Look, it would be interesting to see where it comes from. So I know we have multiple ranking systems. So obviously in Australia you have your own ranking systems. Then obviously StatCheck have the CRS scores. There's still the ITC scoring system, and there's the UKTC scoring system. So it'd be interesting to see where it all comes out and ranks out. And I think time will tell essentially how all things wrap out and what happens with 10th edition. So yeah, it's funny. We mentioned before a bunch of game communities and stuff like that, and the Dota community was the worst and the game community was the worst. But let's have a little fun game. So start with yourself, Brendan. So who on the scale, we'll rank them from 1, 2, or 3. Who was better? Was it the Warhammer community, the Magic the Gathering community, or let's say your StarCraft community? Because I don't think you played Dota or other things like that. Or if you played League of Legends, we'll go League of Legends.
The computer games were always the worst.
Yeah.
They're always the worst.
What?
Magic and 40k both have their issues in the community. And Magic's community also is a lot more developed, I guess. Magic's community 20 years ago was pretty toxic and nasty. Maybe 25 years ago. But nowadays it's very open. There's so many more... Well, I don't know if it's where I live in the world, but there's so many more people of various races and genders that are just involved. Whereas in 40k, it seems very predominantly wealthy, white, cis men. And that ain't great. But they're also a little bit less hardcore. Every Magic event I went to, there was a game where at the end my opponent was pissed off. And part of that is you play a lot more people. Part of that is there's a lot more on the line. But I think the vast majority of 40k events I've gone to, I never had an opponent end the game pissed off either at me or at the game or at their army. It happens every now and then, but most people are just there to have fun rather than there to win. Part of that's because the prize support is so poor, but
Yeah, I think that's a fair sentiment. Ash, so what do you think of the communities? Obviously, you said Dota. You didn't have the most polite review of them, but between Dota, Magic the Gathering, and Warhammer communities, how would you rank them all or view them?
I mean, I would broadly agree with that take. I think for me, Magic was good. I definitely liked going to an event and seeing multiple women there. But it was maybe it's just because I never got as into it as I've got into 40k. I really did like Magic, but I don't know, I just didn't end up connecting as much with that community. So it always felt just a bit, fine, nothing wrong with it. And then, I really enjoy the Warhammer community, get along well with a lot of people. I've been honestly shocked with how nice everybody is. I mean, I'm playing Warhammer, but I'm playing internet Warhammer with random people from across the world on the internet, and I'm having really good experiences pretty much across the board with everyone who I play against, which is absolutely astounding. And then we have the video game stuff, which, oh boy, look, Dota makes people toxic. It's just the design of getting 5 random people from across the world and making them play on a team together. But I will say that although I didn't connect as much with individual members of the community, I think that the big personalities from both Dota and especially StarCraft are a lot of people that I've really respected who have taught, especially StarCraft people have taught me a lot of important things about games as well. There have been some great lessons learned from those, the analysts and casters over there. So it's not intrinsic to playing video games that you must be a shit-flinging monkey. It just kind of happens due to the anonymity, I think. Whereas with Warhammer, when you're playing a 3-hour-long game and you're talking to each other back and forth the whole time, there's kind of a limit to the number of slurs that you can use before it just falls apart. You're sort of forced to be at least a little bit polite and respectful and normal towards an opponent in Warhammer. And that really does help change the overall quality of discourse throughout the whole community, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very fair sentiment at the end. They're like, you have to talk to your opponent for the 3 hours. Whereas in a game of Magic or even a game of poker or a game across the table, some of those games you could literally never talk to your opponent and play the whole game, or you are not obliged to, I guess, keep a friendly game per se in a sense. So whereas I think Magic Warhammer is... you go.
Oh yeah, like Magic in theory, you need to talk just like you would in Warhammer. I mean, it's an in-person game traditionally that you play by putting things on a table and saying this does this guy attacks this. But you can, for the most part, play a game of Magic without saying a word, or play a game of Magic with someone who you don't share a language with, and that's really cool. Especially the second part, that you can, it can be a universal language of sorts, but it does mean that because of all Warhammer's weird little shaky rules and strange interactions and all the imprecisions of saying, this guy is totally 6.1 inches away from this guy so that you can't do this and that. There needs to be a constant back and forth conversation in a way that Magic even doesn't achieve, and StarCraft definitely doesn't. You don't communicate with your opponent in that game.
No, absolutely not. Just some BM at the end, say GG, and that's about it. So there you go. But no, that's all right. So no, thank you for that. And I think it's fair to say like there's different communities serve different purposes. So look, and I think the Warhammer community, thankfully, is a very open and accepting one, and should be so. And hopefully, it'll grow and develop over time, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes. So before we wrap things up, so I'll go to hand it over to you, Brendan. So is there any final plugs or things you wanted to mention that maybe you want to plug for people who maybe want to listen for more things from you, or things you just wanted to talk about?
Not really. You're always welcome. Anybody who wants to come join the Sisters subreddit or the Sisters Discord, we're very open and welcoming there, and I think we have decent communities. The Sisters subreddit needs an update for 10th, and I haven't quite built up the oomph to do that yet with the pile we got dealt, but we'll see how that goes. Other than that, I'm just around. You see this peacock somewhere, you can give me a shout.
Absolutely. Brendan's very kind. He's on many, many Discords, so I'm sure you can find him there. And I can personally vouch that the Sisters Reddit and Discord is great. And Sister Act 40K is an amazing podcast as well. And they've got a really awesome special private Patreon community. So definitely go join there if you want some more Sisters Act goodness, or just even to talk smack about the Emperor's favorite fanatical sisters. So yeah. Ashley, any final plugs or shout outs you want to have, or any final comments?
That's think about it for comments. In terms of plugs, I do have a blog, pietyandpain.wordpress.com, which should be linked in the description. I've been told that much. Kind of named it because Sisters and Drukhari are my two favorite factions, and I intended to talk about them a whole lot. And then a lot of things happened, and I am sure not talking about Sisters right now because it would be very depressing. But I have been writing a lot of Drukhari articles, so if you play the coolest elf faction and strong competitor for coolest faction in the whole game. Sorry, but sisters aren't quite as good as Drukari. Then, go and give that a look. But yeah, that's about all my plugs.
The first models I ever bought were Drukari models. They were called Dark Eldar back then. It was the third edition launch box, I think, with Black Templar and Dark Eldar. And then my mom read the Dark Eldar Codex, and I wasn't allowed to play them anymore.
Okay, fair enough.
She went out and bought me a $300 Imperial Guard army box the next day and said, "You're playing these now."
Well, so, will you come back to the dark side per se, Brendan, or you're a fanatical sister through and through, and you're not going to expand beyond that?
I tend not to like playing the archetypical bad guys, which is weird in 40k because they're kind of all archetypical. When I was 12, I didn't get the nuances, okay? That being said, I've just never really enjoyed the evil for evil's sake. Being evil because the system makes you be evil is just more interesting to me than being evil because it's fun and you hate people.
Sure, more than fair enough. So that makes sense. So just for us, for people who want to maybe learn more about other competitive games and how they relate to Warhammer, there's some links in the description below. So one book called Playing to Win by David Serlin is a really good book for people who are aspiring competitive players. So Ash, for people who are listening and nodding her head, it's from more of like a fighting game stance, but it's really good. It's got some fundamental knowledge from chess and fighting games and other competitive games and how it corresponds. And I'll also leave a description to a link of other Magic the Gathering articles, which are really relevant and interesting. One talking about teamwork and how it's important to develop a team to talk about various lists and stuff like that, which is, I think, very relevant to Warhammer. And something that's a bit more personal. It's a story about a guy, I can't remember the article itself, but it talks about how he won essentially a GT, but what did it cost for him and his family and pursuing other things. So I don't know, a bit more of a somber note, but something I think relatively important to you. What's your time? What's it worth winning a GP versus maybe spending time with your family, doing other things outside of Magic the Gathering for him? But I think it's a relevant article and something that everyone should consider. So yeah, so really appreciate you both having it on. Just final plugs, so sponsors, so D6 Designs AU, so for down under 40k's got a little logo there. So if you want some new cool Sisters dice, they've got some awesome ones there, as well as there's a Patreon, so patreon.com/down under 40k. So help support myself and other content creators on the Down under 40k network. Do what we love. So thank you very much, both Ash and Brendan, for joining the show. And thank you for everyone for listening. And join you all soon on another Discord near you. So thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.